Welcome to Velvet Crimes, where every whisper hides a secret and every clue waits in the half-light. Tonight's tale, Sherlock Holmes and the Coffin that arrived empty, begins not with blood, but with silence. A small coffin delivered to Baker Street, its lid carved with a craftsman's mark and its contents utterly void. From that emptiness will unfold a riddle of guilt, echoes, and a voice that refused to die. Before we begin the mystery, steady your thoughts. For some sounds never fade, and every silence in this story has something left to say. It was not the hour for visitors, and yet the knock came, a hesitant, hollow sound, as though from gloved fingers uncertain of their purpose. Holmes, whose violin lay silent across his knees, raised an eyebrow but did not look up. The fire cracked once, and I remember thinking that the flame had mimicked the visitor's own wavering resolve. "Come in," Holmes said, his tone brisk, his eyes fixed on the instrument's strings. The door opened to reveal a man of pallid complexion and the curious stiffness of one who has walked too far to stop. He clutched a small square parcel wrapped in brown paper, its corners softened by rain. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. His voice trembled. Not from cold, I thought, but from the effort of holding himself intact. Holmes inclined his head. "And this, I presume, is the reason you've come." He gestured toward the parcel with the faintest movement of his bow hand. The man looked at it as if surprised to see it still there. "It arrived at my door this morning," he said, "addressed to my late father, who has been dead these 6 months. I did not know what else to do but bring it to you." I took the parcel, noting its weight, lighter than I expected, and the faint scent of earth. Holmes rose now, setting aside the violin. "Dr. Watson, if you please." The paper tore with a muted sigh. Inside was a coffin. A child's coffin, exquisitely carved, no more than 18 inches in length. Within it lay nothing. The man's throat worked. There was no note, no name, only this. He drew from his coat a narrow envelope, sealed with black wax. The seal bore the impression of a serpent swallowing its tail. Holmes examined it without opening. "Curious," he murmured. "No postmark, no adhesive wear. It was hand-delivered." The visitor nodded. "At dawn, according to my servant. Left upon the doorstep as though the sender preferred the message to speak for itself," Holmes finished. He turned the coffin in his hands, tilting it toward the firelight. A single, faint scratch marred the polish near the hinge, as if a tool had slipped during its making, or as though someone had once tried, briefly, to force it open. Holmes leaned close, sniffed the wood, and then tapped the base lightly with his finger. The sound was uneven, not the clean resonance of solid oak. "Watson," he said, "what do you hear?" I listened. A hollow tone, perhaps a false panel beneath. Holmes's lips curved slightly. "Precisely. Fetch the penknife from the mantel." A faint hum from the street outside drew our attention, the low roll of carriage wheels retreating into distance. Holmes waited until the sound had faded, then prized open the base. A puff of dark dust rose, acrid and dry. Within the recess lay a strip of coarse linen, and upon it a smear of something brown that was not yet rust. The visitor took an involuntary step back. "Blood?" "Possibly," Holmes said, "or paint designed to suggest it. But more intriguing is what's missing." "What do you mean?" I asked. He turned the lid toward us. The coffin was meant to contain something that could rattle or stain, hence the false bottom to secure it. But our sender wished the recipient to see only absence. An empty coffin speaks more loudly than one filled. The man shivered. "You think it's a threat?" "I think," said Holmes, "it is the beginning of a conversation." He motioned for me to hand him the envelope. Breaking the seal, he drew out a single card. Upon it, in a precise copper-plate hand, were 3 words: "At midnight's toll." Holmes stared at it for several seconds before placing it flat upon the table. "Mr. Fenton," he said quietly, "did your father have enemies?" The man hesitated. "Not that I know of. He was a carpenter by trade. Respectable. Died of a seizure last winter." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A carpenter, then he worked with coffins?" "Occasionally," Fenton admitted, "for the parish, when deaths were too many for the undertaker alone." Holmes nodded slowly. "How curious. A coffin maker receives a coffin after death. A perfect inversion." He paced once across the rug, hands behind his back, the faint squeak of the floorboard under his heel marking each turn. The sound repeated, soft, rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock. "You said the delivery occurred at dawn," Holmes murmured. "Then whoever brought it knew the household's habits. No one saw the messenger?" "No, sir." "Then it must have been placed during that transitional hour when night hands over to day, when even the watchmen doubt their own eyes." He stopped pacing. "Watson, note the message. At midnight's toll. That gives us less than 12 hours. "For what?" I asked. He did not answer directly. "For the next sound to follow this one." His fingers tapped the coffin's hollow base once more, the faint wooden echo lingering like a question unanswered. Outside, a clock began to chime the quarter hour. Holmes listened, then turned to Fenton. "Return home. Speak of this to no one. Watson and I will call upon you before midnight." The man looked relieved, though fear still shadowed his eyes. When he had gone, closing the door softly behind him, Holmes lifted the small coffin once more, weighing it in silence. The air in Baker Street seemed to contract, as though the walls themselves were listening. "What do you suppose it means, Holmes?" I ventured. He smiled faintly. "It means, my dear Watson, that someone has dug up the past and intends to bury the truth in its place." The fire popped, sending a spark into the grate. Holmes's eyes followed it as though tracing a thought made visible. Then he said, almost to himself, "At midnight's toll, the sound that ends one life and begins another." The hum of the street had long since faded, but I fancied I heard again that hollow knock, repeating faintly, from somewhere beyond the walls. The echo of that imagined knock still hung in my mind as Holmes leaned closer to the fireplace, holding the tiny coffin's lid near the flame. The varnish caught the light unevenly, revealing faint indentations I had not noticed before. Small letters pressed into the grain and later sealed beneath polish. Holmes turned it, eyes narrowing. "Look closely, Watson. The craftsman's mark has been scraped away, but not erased. These letters once read, 'W. Fenton, Joiner.' The son brings me a coffin made by the father." "That cannot be coincidence," I said. "It seldom is." He tapped the lid lightly with the bough he still held, the tone dull now, muted by heat. "A coffin maker receives one of his own, empty, after death. Someone wishes to suggest resurrection or accusation." He set it down and crossed to his desk, where he began to fill his pipe. The faint rasp of the match followed, and the smoke rose in soft coils. "Tell me, Watson," he said between drags, "what did you make of the son?" "Haunted. Not merely by grief. There was guilt in his tone." "Precisely. Yet his fear seemed directed not toward the coffin itself, but toward what it might recall. A man who has inherited his father's sins fears messages from the grave." The fire cracked again, and the hollow sound of wood against iron seemed to answer him. Holmes's gaze flicked upward. "Listen to that, Watson. The echo. Every sound tonight appears to be conversing with its own absence. Curious, is it not?" I smiled. "You're beginning to anthropomorphize the acoustics of Baker Street." He ignored the remark. "I'm beginning to listen differently. There is more intelligence in a hollow echo than in a dozen confessions." He stood abruptly, pulling on his coat. "We must see where that echo leads. Fenton's address, if you please." I fetched my notebook. "Grosvenor Place, near the old churchyard." Fitting. Fetch your revolver. Our visit may not be purely social. Moments later, we were in the hansom cab, the rain tapping its nervous rhythm on the roof. Holmes remained silent for much of the journey, but I saw him turn the small coffin over in his hands like a puzzle box. "You believe the sender intends violence?" I asked. "Violence, or memory, which can be the same thing," he said softly. "Note the timing, delivery at dawn, message fixed to midnight. Whoever sent it measures life by ritual, not by chance." The cab turned sharply, the wheels striking loose cobbles that made a hollow clatter beneath us. Holmes glanced toward the window, listening as though to verify an unseen pulse. "That sound again," he murmured. "A rhythm repeating itself through different mediums. Knock, echo, wheel, heart. The same motif pursues us." When we reached Grosvenor Place, the lamps were thin and untrustworthy. Fenton's house stood narrow and dark, its shutters closed. A servant answered our knock, timid, blinking. Holmes brushed past him with quiet authority. "Your master?" "In the workshop, sir. Down the passage." The passage smelled faintly of wood shavings and varnish. As we entered, a rasping noise stopped. Then a door creaked open. Fenton emerged, pale and startled. "Mr. Holmes, you came sooner than I expected." Holmes's gaze swept the room. Coffins in various stages of completion lined the walls, their open lids catching candlelight like mute mouths. "You have continued your father's trade?" "Yes, it pays the rent." "Was this his workshop?" Fenton nodded. Holmes approached the nearest coffin, its surface half-polished. "And this one, was it begun before or after your father's death?" "Before. He never finished it. I couldn't bring myself to sell it." Holmes bent, examining a mark at the base. "The same chisel pattern as on the small coffin. You see, Watson, the hand that carved this also carved that." Fenton swallowed. "You mean my father made the one sent to him?" "Precisely. But who possessed it after his death? Who would know to return it now?" Fenton hesitated. "He had an apprentice once. Name of Larch. Dismissed under unpleasant circumstances." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Explain." "He was caught removing valuables from the pockets of the dead before burial. My father turned him out. There was a quarrel. Larch swore he'd repay the humiliation." "When did this occur?" "Nearly a year ago." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, note the pattern. A man disgraced in death's trade, a coffin returned empty, and a message promising midnight. Larch's revenge, perhaps, but not a simple one." He paced the workshop, each step landing with the faint, hollow thud that had followed us since Baker Street. "That sound again," he muttered. "This floor, hollow beneath. There's something below." Fenton looked alarmed. "It's only the old cellar. We keep timber there." Holmes stooped, pressing his ear to the boards. "Timber doesn't breathe, Mr. Fenton, yet I distinctly hear a slow exhalation." I listened, holding my breath. From beneath us came a muffled scrape, then silence. "Someone's down there," Holmes whispered. Fenton's face drained of color. "Impossible. The door's locked." Then whoever entered came from the other side. Holmes found the trap door in seconds, its edges disguised by sawdust. He gestured for me to stand ready, then lifted it quietly. The air that rose was cold and faintly metallic. We descended into a narrow space lit by a single lantern left burning low. Against the far wall stood another coffin, full-sized, closed. A fresh one. The lid was fastened, and on it lay a strip of linen, identical to the one from the small box above. Holmes approached, eyes bright. Our craftsman of the dead worked swiftly. He raised the lid a few inches and peered within. A strangled gasp escaped him, not of fear, but of astonished recognition. "What is it, Holmes?" He lowered the lid slowly. "The coffin is empty," yet its lining bears a human outline still warm. Someone has only just left it. I felt a chill. Left it? You mean escaped? He nodded. And by the look of that dust at the far vent, through there. We followed him to a narrow opening that led beneath the street, a passage half collapsed. Holmes examined the marks along its edge. Boot heel, recent. And this. Watson, note the residue. Varnish mixed with blood. Whoever lay within that coffin was wounded, but alive. Larch? Or the man he meant to frighten? The roles of corpse and culprit appear interchangeable tonight. A faint sound interrupted us. The same hollow knock, but now distinct and close. 3 measured taps from somewhere beyond the vent. Holmes froze. "Midnight's rehearsal," he murmured. "He wants us to hear the toll before the hour arrives." The lantern flickered. The air moved. Somewhere above, the church bell began its slow, solemn preparation, testing its rope. Holmes replaced the lid, eyes fixed upward. "Watson, we are no longer chasing a criminal. We are interrupting a ritual." The knock came again, closer, then stopped as the first true stroke of midnight began to fall. The first toll shook the air like the slow inhalation of something waking below us. Holmes raised a hand, and we held still as the sound rolled through the timbers overhead. Dust sifted down in fine motes, catching the lantern's trembling glow. Another stroke followed, measured, patient, echoing through the hollow floorboards like the heartbeat of the very mystery we stood within. "Count, Watson," Holmes whispered. 2, 3. At the 6th, there came a faint answering tap from beyond the vent, perfectly synchronized. Holmes's eyes flashed. "He's timing himself to the bell. Mark that. It tells us our adversary is not fleeing. He's performing." I shuddered. Performing what, for heaven's sake? The completion of a promise. The 12th chime landed, heavy as earth, upon a coffin lid. When its resonance faded, silence spread, too complete, as though the world had paused to listen for the next act. Holmes replaced the lantern on the ground and motioned toward the passage. "Come, Watson, bring your revolver." The tunnel beyond was scarcely wide enough for us to crouch. The air grew colder, touched with the mineral damp of old graves. Our boots stirred the same hollow tone that had followed us all night. It was less a sound now than a pulse, one that seemed to echo inside the chest rather than the ear. After some 20 yards, the passage rose to a rusted gate. Holmes pressed his face to the bars, then forced it with a twist of his walking stick. Beyond lay a crypt. Empty nicks gaped from the walls, and the remnants of shattered masonry formed steps leading up toward a faint light. "Beneath the church," Holmes murmured. "He's drawn us under consecrated ground." The faint scrape of movement ahead answered him. We climbed. A sliver of candlelight trembled through a gap in the stone. Holmes extinguished our lantern and peered through. On the far side of the crypt, a figure knelt before an open coffin, life-sized, unfinished wood. A man's voice muttered softly, rhythmic, almost tender. He was sanding the inner edges with long, deliberate strokes. With each motion came that same hollow knock of tool against board, the sound that had pursued us from the beginning. "Larch," Holmes breathed. The name must have carried, for the man stopped. Slowly he turned, his face thin, the eyes sunk deep beneath the brim of a workman's cap. There was no surprise in them, only a weary recognition, as though he had expected us all along. "So," he said, voice calm, "the dead do send their messengers." Holmes stepped into the light. "You mistake me for a herald of your own conscience, Mr. Larch. I'm merely the man who follows the trail you've left behind. One hollow note at a time." Larch's mouth twitched. "You heard it then, the call of the wood. It speaks to any who listen. Your friend hears it too, I think." Holmes gestured for me to stay back. "You returned your master's coffin." "Why?" to remind his son that some debts are not buried with the body. He thought to shame me, but he profited well from the trade of death. Each coffin sold twice, once to the parish, once again to those who feared discovery. Holmes's eyes sharpened, bodies substituted, graves sealed empty. Larch smiled. You see the truth quickly. A father's hands more skilled at deception than mine ever were. When the law came close, he feigned repentance. I was sent away to bear the blame. And so you made this theater of vengeance. Not vengeance, he said, tapping the coffin with a fingertip. Justice. He lies nowhere that can be found, because his work buried him long before the earth did. Holmes advanced, the echo of his boots drawing nearer. Yet someone lay here tonight, a body absent now but freshly removed. Was it your master, or the part of yourself you cannot kill? Larch's hand slid into his coat. Holmes moved faster, striking the chisel aside before it could rise. The tool clattered, ringing against the coffin's rim, a sharp metallic note that hung in the crypt's stale air. The man stumbled back, clutching his arm. I told you, Holmes said quietly. This is not about the dead. It's about the living who pretend to join them. I hurried forward to assist, but Holmes waved me off and stooped beside the open coffin. Look, Watson. He lifted a folded sheet of newspaper from its interior. It was stiff with varnish, edges browned by candle heat. Across the headline was an inky smear that once spelled The Evening Post. Holmes spread it flat. A death notice cut short. See here, William Fenton, aged 63, carpenter and joiner, interred, and nothing beyond. Our craftsman planned his own erasure, assisted perhaps by this very man. Larch laughed weakly. He begged me for silence. I gave it to him. In wood. You sealed him alive. I granted his wish. Holmes's face hardened. You mistake mercy for mutilation. The man sagged to the floor, head in hands. He said the parish would never forgive him. The empty coffins were for the cholera pits. They paid twice for the same grave. He feared exposure more than death, and so arranged his own burial in secrecy, I murmured. Holmes nodded. Then months later, you returned the token to the son, who must live with the riddle of an empty coffin, both his father's guilt and his own inheritance of it. An elegant cruelty. Larch looked up, tears cutting pale lines through the dust. Cruel. He left me starving while he confessed to God. I left him the truth. Holmes turned away, his voice low. The truth seldom spares those who summon it. He examined the small coffin still clutched under his arm, the twin to the larger one before us. A replica, symbolic, meant to lure us to the scene. The church bell above gave a faint metallic shudder, the chain settling from its midnight toll. Holmes listened, then spoke softly. Watson, take note. When the bell ceased, so did our knocking phantom. The message was never for the ear, but for the conscience. I studied Larch, now silent in the candlelight. What will become of him? Holmes sighed. That depends upon whether the law judges guilt by act or intent. I shall deliver both versions to Lestrade in the morning. As he said this, his attention shifted toward the far end of the crypt, where a faint draught stirred the candle flame. The sound that followed was unmistakable. A slow, hollow knock, this time not wood but stone from beneath the flagstones on which we stood. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Ah, he whispered. It appears the grave still has something to say. Holmes dropped to one knee, pressing his ear to the stone. The sound came again, a deliberate tapping, muffled yet regular, as if knuckles struck from below. The rhythm was measured, neither frantic nor random. 3 beats, a pause, then 2. The same cadence that had haunted us since Baker Street. Someone's alive down there, I cried. Or someone intends us to believe so, Holmes murmured. The pattern repeats too precisely for desperation. Still, he rose swiftly, scanning the crypt. Fetch that pry bar, Watson. We must confirm. Larch made a choking sound. You can't open it, he said. That section's sealed by the church. No one has been buried there for years. Holmes fixed him with that level, piercing stare I had seen unnerve murderers twice his size. Then you will not object if the dead object on their own behalf. We worked the edge of the slab loose. The old mortar cracked, releasing a breath of cold, stale air that carried the faint odor of damp linen and wax. Holmes held the lantern close. The light trembled, catching a hint of movement below, something white shifting in the darkness. He turned to Larch. You told us your master begged for silence. You did not say who heard the plea. Larch's lips moved soundlessly, his gaze fixed on the widening gap. Holmes prized the stone aside and lowered the lantern. What it revealed sent a shock through me that I shall not soon forget. A man lay within the recess, motionless but not skeletal. His face was the color of old parchment, yet the chest rose faintly with breath. Around him were remnants of rotted wood and a single broken chisel clasped in one stiff hand. Good Lord, I whispered. He's alive. Barely, Holmes said. He crouched beside the opening, examining the man's pulse at the throat. Faint but present. We must have air, Watson. Clear that vent at once. As I obeyed, Larch staggered backward, staring as though at an apparition. It can't be him, he muttered. I sealed it myself. Holmes's voice was calm, clinical. A coffin sealed to ensure a man's disappearance, not his death. You mistook unconsciousness for finality. The blow to the head, perhaps from the chisel. He must have revived too late. The man's eyelids fluttered. A hoarse rasp escaped his lips, barely words. Larch, you promised. Larch dropped to his knees beside the slab. Master, I thought you gone. Holmes seized his arm. Stand back. He has endured more than your remorse. The wounded man's eyes rolled toward us, clouded yet aware. Not revenge. Atonement. The whisper trailed off. Holmes leaned closer. Mr. Fenton Sr., can you hear me? You sent the coffin to your son? A weak nod. Why? His lips cracked into a faint smile. To make him dig deeper than I ever did. Then the breath left him in a long, thin sigh that seemed to merge with the hollow stillness around us. Holmes placed 2 fingers against the throat, waited, then lowered his hand. Gone, he said softly. Larch made a low sound, half sob, half prayer. Holmes rose, his expression unreadable. Watson, note the sequence. The son receives an empty coffin. The father lies hidden alive beneath the church. The apprentice carries guilt for a death that was never certain. Every participant driven by penitence rather than profit. A morbid trinity of remorse. He turned abruptly toward the wall. Yet something remains unresolved. The hand that delivered the coffin this morning, that was not Fenton nor Larch, and certainly not a coincidence. I frowned. Who else would have known of its existence? Holmes's eyes darted toward the entrance. Precisely the question, and one perhaps answered by that sound. Even as he spoke, the crypt door creaked open above, and a shaft of lamplight cut through the gloom. A shadow moved across the stair. Holmes motioned me to silence and stepped behind one of the stone pillars. Larch shrank into the opposite corner. Footsteps descended, careful and deliberate. Stay where you are, Holmes called suddenly, stepping forward. Another inch and I shall assume intent. The newcomer froze. Then, into the light, came the figure of a woman. Modestly dressed, her face half veiled. She carried a small oil lamp and a folded paper in her other hand. Mrs. Fenton, Holmes said quietly. She looked from him to the open slab, then to the still form within. The paper fell from her fingers. He wanted peace, she whispered. Holmes retrieved the sheet. A letter, addressed to your son. He scanned it quickly. A confession. He meant it to be found after his death. But you... I could not let it destroy him, she cried. Henry had no part in his father's shame. When that awful box arrived, I thought it a curse returned. I meant to burn it, but the boy saw. He insisted on bringing it to you. Holmes's tone softened. You delivered it yourself. She nodded miserably. Before dawn. I could not sleep for fear. He folded the paper. Then we come full circle. A wife conceals, a husband repents, a son inherits the consequence, and a servant revives the guilt. Each acted out of love, twisted by secrecy. The echo of his words seemed to linger in the stones, a faint reverberation like the memory of the earlier tapping. Larch's voice broke the silence. What will become of us, Mr. Holmes? Holmes regarded him with something near pity. You will stand before the magistrate, but I shall speak of your ignorance. As for your master, he is beyond earthly judgment. The rest is for the living to decide. What truth to bury and what to exhume. He gestured toward the small coffin on the table. Watson, place that beside him. It was his message to the world, and now perhaps it may serve as his peace. I obeyed. The wood gave that same faint hollow tone as it touched the stone, a soft, final echo. Holmes straightened, brushing dust from his sleeve. Do you hear it, Watson? The motif resolves itself. The hollow becomes full, the silence complete. Only then can a conscience rest. Yet even as he spoke, a sound arose that made us all turn. From the stair above came the clear metallic click of the crypt door locking from the outside. Holmes's eyes narrowed, voice low. So then, the living have not finished their burial after all. The click echoed through the crypt like a pistol misfiring in fog. Sharp, absolute, final. Mrs. Fenton gasped, spinning toward the stair. Holmes was already moving, testing the door's iron handle. It did not yield. He pressed his ear against the wood. Beyond it, silence, thick and patient. Locked from without, he murmured. Someone wished to ensure this scene remained unobserved, or unfinished. Larch looked upward, panic edging his voice. You think they mean to trap us here? I think, said Holmes, that our visitor had foreknowledge of our presence, which narrows the field to one who knew both the hour and the players assembled. Mrs. Fenton, you are quite certain no one followed you? No one, she cried. I left before dawn. Yet you returned now, unbidden, Holmes interjected. Something drew you? She hesitated. A note was delivered to my home an hour ago. It bore only the words, "Come to him now," before the toll repeats. I thought it must be about my husband. Holmes's brow furrowed. Show me the note. I left it on the table when I came. Holmes turned to me. Watson, do you mark the precision of our antagonist? Each summons, each sound arrives timed to the bell. He governs our movements as if conducting a requiem. The air was growing colder. Our breath showed faintly in the lantern light. Holmes paced the chamber, his footsteps producing that familiar hollow rhythm, the motif now merging with the soft creak of coffins around us. We are not imprisoned by force, he said finally, but by design. The door is locked, yes, but not to detain. It isolates. A stage set for revelation. Mrs. Fenton's hand trembled. Revelation? Of what? Of truth, or its counterfeit. He turned suddenly toward the far wall where the sound of the bell's earlier vibration still seemed to linger. Observe, Watson, the vent through which the air rises, large enough for a small instrument or a voice. You think someone has been using it to send the knocks? Holmes nodded. Precisely. The sequence we heard could not originate beneath the stone once opened. It must have been relayed. Someone above ground manipulating our perceptions, ensuring each discovery followed the rhythm he dictated. Then the bell itself, an accomplice, Holmes said curtly, or a cover. Every sound conceals another. He drew a slender wire from his pocket and began probing the vent. After a moment, he smiled grimly and withdrew a thin metal tube capped with a parchment disc. A simple speaking conduit. Ingenious. He unrolled the parchment. On it were the words, "Bury what you find, or it will bury you." Mrs. Fenton swayed, catching the pillar for support. "It's him," she whispered. "My husband wrote that phrase in his last diary. I saw it once, years ago." "Then someone has access to his papers," Holmes said. "Someone within the household." Larch looked bewildered. "But who?" "The boy." Holmes's tone softened, almost regretful. "You underestimate the inheritance of guilt, my friend. The son who grows in shadow often seeks light by the same crooked path." Mrs. Fenton clutched her shawl. "You mean Henry?" "No, he was terrified when the parcel came. He would never—" "Fear can turn swiftly to curiosity," Holmes said. "He brings the Coffin to Baker Street, drawing us into his father's labyrinth. Every revelation since has occurred as if arranged for witness. Tell me, Mrs. Fenton, where is your son now?" "At home, I think." Holmes's gaze snapped upward. "Then he is precisely where our unseen conductor must stand. Come, Watson, we have little time before the next toll." He crossed to the door and examined the lock. A thin smile formed. "Our jailer is thorough but unimaginative." From his pocket he produced a small metal pick, working with quick precision. The mechanism clicked open with a muted sigh, echoing faintly against the stone. "Mrs. Fenton, remain here with Larch. Watson, with me." We climbed into the stairwell. The church above was unlit save for the distant flicker of votive lamps. As we emerged into the nave, the air felt heavy, soaked with wax and damp stone. Somewhere beyond the pews, a faint scuff echoed, the same deliberate rhythm as before. Holmes motioned for silence and advanced between the rows. Each step he took answered with a hollow whisper from the floorboards, a perfect continuation of the motif, as if the building itself remembered our pursuit. Near the altar stood the boy, Henry Fenton, his face ghostly pale in the half-light. In his hands, he held the church key and a small mallet. "Henry," Holmes said evenly, "you've chosen a solemn stage for confession." The youth started, eyes wide. "I didn't mean, Mr. Holmes, you weren't supposed to survive the lesson." Holmes's voice was gentle but relentless. "You wrote the note to your mother, you delivered the coffin at dawn, and now, after ensuring every soul returned to the crypt, you lock the door. Why?" Tears filled the boy's eyes. "To keep it quiet, to end it. Father wanted his sins forgotten, but they won't die. They keep knocking." Holmes advanced, his tone now almost paternal. "So you sought to stage the past, to let each discover what they feared most until remorse consumed them." "I only wanted to make them see," the boy cried. "Mother kept lying, Larch kept hiding, and he left us nothing but shame." "You thought to exhume the truth, but truth has its own breath," Holmes said. "It nearly suffocated you tonight." Henry trembled, the mallet slipping from his grasp. "When I heard the bell, I thought it was him, that he'd come for us." Holmes reached out, taking the key gently. "He has come, Henry, but only through what you stirred. The dead seldom knock without invitation." The boy broke then, sinking to his knees, sobbing quietly. Holmes looked down at him with a mixture of weariness and compassion I had rarely seen. "Watson," he said softly, "we shall send Lestrade word at once. This case has had its fill of graves." A deep vibration rolled through the church, the clock winding itself toward 1. Holmes froze. "The hour repeats sooner than expected. The mechanism's been tampered with." He turned toward the bell tower, eyes narrowing. "Someone else is here." Before I could speak, the first bell stroke fell, louder than before, reverberating through wood and stone. But beneath it, faint yet unmistakable, came another sound, a hollow knock answering from within the crypt below, as if the earth itself had begun to reply. Holmes whispered, "No living hand makes that rhythm now." The resonance shuddered through the timbers, a violent mingling of metal and void. The bell's roar faded into that steady, measured knock below. 3, then 2, unbroken, insistent. Holmes moved like a flash toward the stair leading down, his coat flaring behind him. I followed, the sound drawing us downward as if by some invisible tether. "Stay here," he called back to Henry. "Whatever stirs beneath, it answers to conscience, not command." "But what is it?" the boy cried. "Proof," Holmes said, already vanishing into shadow. We descended, the rhythm strengthening with each step. The crypt door gaped open where Holmes had left it, but the lantern within was now extinguished. Darkness thickened, broken only by the tremor of the knocking that seemed to shift position as we entered. "Watson, hold your light low," Holmes murmured. I struck a match, its flame flickering uncertainly. The air tasted of wax and damp stone. "There," Holmes said, pointing toward the opened recess where old Fenton had lain. The coffin was empty. I stared, stunned. "Gone?" "Not gone," he corrected. "Removed. And recently, the dust unsettled, the linen still damp with perspiration. Someone descended after us." The echo of the bell above died altogether. What replaced it was softer, more intimate. A dragging scrape, wood upon stone from the far side of the crypt. Holmes strode toward the sound. "Keep close, Watson." We rounded the pillar and froze. A second coffin, the smaller, ornamental one, had been set upright against the wall. Its lid quivered slightly, as though something within responded to our presence. Holmes whispered, "It is not the dead that frighten me, Watson, but the living who imitate them." He pressed his hand to the lid. It trembled once more, then fell still. With a sudden motion, he flung it open. Inside stood Henry Fenton, eyes wide, body rigid, as if caught in some trance. He clutched a brass tube, the speaking conduit Holmes had discovered earlier. "Holmes," I gasped. "How—" The boy's lips moved, soundless at first, then forming words that broke unevenly. I heard it again, down here, calling my name. I thought, if I answered, it would stop. Holmes took the tube from his hands. "You returned through the tower passage. You meant to silence the echo, yet you became its voice. The system is self-resonant, Watson. Each knock answered by its own reflection through the conduit." Henry blinked, confused. "Then there's no one else?" Holmes's tone was grave. "No one but ourselves. The mechanism, once set, perpetuates its own ghost. Your father's dying breath may have struck the first note. Every conscience since has kept it alive." The boy sank to the floor, head in hands. "Then I've been haunting my own family." Holmes knelt beside him. "You sought to bury shame, but sound is memory made visible. It travels farther than guilt and returns when least expected. What you mistook for your father's summons was the echo of your own fear." A sudden clatter above made him look up. Footsteps hurried across the nave. The bell rope swayed visibly through the vent, its end whipping faintly as though tugged by unseen hands. Holmes rose, listening. "Someone else has entered," I whispered. He shook his head. "Not someone. Something released." He raised the lantern and moved toward the stair. "Mrs. Fenton and Larch remain above. They must not leave until we confirm who or what woke that bell." As we ascended, the air grew warmer, charged. The church seemed to hum with its own resonance. Holmes paused halfway, touching the wall. "Note the vibration. This structure amplifies any low frequency. Our mystery has its root not in the supernatural, but in acoustics. The entire church has become a single instrument, designed, whether by chance or by design, to speak." When we emerged into the nave, Mrs. Fenton stood rigid near the altar, her eyes fixed on the swinging bell rope. Larch crouched beside her, whispering prayers. The sound persisted, a faint humming through the floorboards. Holmes stepped to the altar rail. Mrs. Fenton, did you touch that rope?" She shook her head. "It moved of its own accord. When you went below, I heard his voice. My husband's voice, calling me by name." Holmes examined the rope's end, then the base of the bell housing above. "The same acoustic system extended upward," he said. "The speaking tube must run through the tower itself. Whoever designed this church understood resonance intimately." Larch looked up, pale. "But who would design such a thing?" "Your master," Holmes replied. "A carpenter, coffin maker, and craftsman of sound wood. He constructed coffins that could whisper, graves that could echo, and now, unwittingly, a church that repeats his confession forever." He turned suddenly toward Henry, who had followed us up. "You see, my boy, your father's trade was not death but memory. He left his sins in the timbers. Every knock, every hollow tone we've chased was his unending apology to the living." Henry's tears returned. "Then all this, the box, the letters, the warnings, were only my own misunderstanding?" "Not entirely," Holmes said softly. "Your guilt completed what his remorse began, a duet between generations." The bell trembled again, the sound swelling into a low moan that filled the nave. Holmes shouted above it, "Watson, to the tower! We must silence the mechanism before it brings the structure down." We ran, ascending the narrow steps. The vibrations intensified, the air vibrating with unseen force. At the final landing, we found the source. The main bell swinging slightly, though no hand touched it, its clapper striking against a suspended wooden brace. The speaking tube ended beside it, still humming faintly. Holmes cut the cord with his knife. The sound died instantly, leaving only the echo of our own breathing. Below, the silence felt immense, sacred even. Holmes turned to me, his expression softened by exhaustion. "There is your culprit, Watson. The physics of conscience. The coffin was merely a resonator, the message self-perpetuating. When the sun answered, the circuit closed. Mystery becomes mechanism." "And the family?" I asked quietly. "They will recover," he said. "Now that silence has been restored, truth may rest again, at least until another heart decides to knock." As we descended, the echo of our steps resumed its familiar, hollow tone, but this time it was gentler, almost human, like breath returning after a long-held pause. Holmes paused at the final step, listening to that faint sound fade into stillness. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he murmured, the world learning, at last, to be quiet. Then, faint and far below, one last solitary knock answered him. Soft, deliberate, and unmistakably timed to the pulse of his own heart. Holmes froze on the stair, every muscle drawn taut, his head inclined toward the sound. The single knock seemed to travel through the stone itself, not air, slow, deliberate, and alive with intention. I felt the hairs rise along my neck. Holmes whispered, "That was no echo." He set the lantern on the step and knelt, pressing his palm flat to the wall. The faintest tremor answered beneath his hand, a vibration like a heartbeat muffled in a coffin's depth. "Watson, light here." I crouched beside him, holding the lantern low. The flicker revealed a narrow seam in the masonry, disguised by centuries of lime wash. Holmes traced it with a fingertip. "A concealed passage," he murmured. "And recently disturbed. Observe the residue. Plaster still crumbles to touch. You think someone remains inside?" He gave a short, grim smile. "We have spent the night pursuing ghosts of sound. Let us see what flesh they wear." Drawing the blade from his walking stick, he wedged it into the crack and levered gently. The mortar gave way with a sigh, like exhaled air. A thin gust escaped, stale, tinged with something faintly chemical. Holmes stiffened. "Chloroform," he said. "Enough to dull the senses, not kill. Whoever hides within wished to render himself unnoticed rather than dead." The slab pivoted inward, revealing a narrow chamber no larger than a wardrobe. Within it stood a man, motionless, upright, his face pale as marble in the lantern glow. His eyes were open. I reached to steady Holmes, certain we faced another corpse. But then the man blinked. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "He's alive!" Holmes regarded him coldly. "Not merely alive, Watson. Listening." The stranger's throat worked soundlessly for a moment before words emerged, dry and uneven. "You should not have opened it yet." Holmes's voice cut through the gloom. "You will forgive the intrusion. The hour has grown late and your experiment has overrun its courtesy." The man swayed, then stepped forward, one hand braced against the wall. He wore a workman's coat flecked with sawdust and varnish, but beneath it gleamed a clerical collar. "Reverend," I said in astonishment. He nodded faintly. "Reverend Sedgwick, custodian of this parish, or was." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "The designer of the resonance." The clergyman managed a brittle smile. "I merely completed it. Fenton laid the timber, but I gave it voice. Sound is the Lord's medium, Mr. Holmes. Vibration, the pulse of creation itself." Holmes's tone cooled further. "And so you built a church that speaks the language of guilt, an admirable experiment, though somewhat lacking in pastoral compassion." Sedgwick looked past him toward the nave below. "They could not hear the truth in words. I gave it tone, rhythm. The bell confesses what the living will not." Holmes stepped closer. "You miscalculated. The structure you designed became self-resonant, a closed system amplifying every regret until it deafened its maker. You turned confession into contagion." The man's eyes gleamed with feverish pride. "Yet you heard it too, did you not? It drew you here. Even reason bends to its calling." "Reason," Holmes said, "requires evidence. You, sir, have merely created an elaborate echo chamber for your own conscience." Sedgwick flinched. "You cannot stop it now. It has learned to speak through others, the boy, the mother, even you, instruments of the same tone." Holmes regarded him with cool pity. "Delusion often hides beneath philosophy. But your words confirm what I suspected. You orchestrated the entire affair. The letters, the coffin, the knocks, to test your theory of auditory guilt." The clergyman's gaze faltered. "I needed subjects. The Fentons were responsive. You exploited their grief. I revealed their truth." Holmes's patience thinned. "And nearly killed them. The old man suffocated, the boy unhinged, the wife driven to hysteria. All because you fancied yourself the divine conductor." Sedgwick's voice rose. "Silence cannot cleanse, Mr. Holmes. Only resonance can purge what festers. The hollow must answer the knock." "Then allow it one last echo," Holmes said curtly. He struck the wall with his palm. The chamber quivered, releasing a deep, tremulous note that seemed to rise from the foundations. The Reverend's eyes widened. "What have you done?" "Balanced your equation," Holmes said. "Every structure that amplifies must also collapse when its frequency is met." A low rumble began, the timbers of the church groaning under strain. Dust sifted down like ash. Holmes seized the Reverend by the collar and pulled him into the stairwell. "Watson, out!" We stumbled upward as the sound swelled. Not chaos, but a perfect sustained tone, as though the building itself sang. In the nave below, pews trembled, windows shuddered. The bell gave one final convulsive strike, then fractured. We burst into the night air as fragments of glass scattered behind us in a rain of color. The resonance ceased, replaced by a silence so vast it seemed alive. Sedgwick sagged in Holmes's grasp, coughing. "You've silenced it," he gasped. "You've killed its voice." Holmes released him gently. Voices that thrive on fear deserve no audience. The Reverend stared at the ruined doorway, tears streaking the dust on his cheeks. "Do you not hear it still?" Holmes tilted his head. For a moment, even I fancied I caught it. a faint, hollow tap, distant as a memory. He smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "but now it beats where it belongs, inside the living." Sedgwick looked stricken, as though the words had stolen the last of his faith. He turned and walked unsteadily toward the graveyard gate, disappearing among the stones. Holmes watched him go, then turned to me. "Our case, Watson, began with a coffin that arrived empty. It ends with one that was never needed. Death, in the end, was only the echo of guilt too long unspoken." I nodded, but before I could answer, there came one final sound from within the church's wrecked doorway. A faint, hollow knock, perfectly measured, like the punctuation to a sermon only half heard. Holmes drew a long breath. "Or perhaps," he murmured, "it is the encore." Holmes did not move. The echo of that final knock still seemed to vibrate through the bones of the air, faint yet precise, like the ghost of a metronome refusing to stop. His gaze remained fixed upon the fractured doorway, the dim ruin beyond pulsing with the glow of the surviving lantern. "Watson," he said at last, "did you mark its rhythm?" "I did," I answered, my voice lower than a whisper. 3 and 2 again, the same as before." "Exactly so," he murmured. "Not an accident, then. The pattern persists without the mechanism to produce it. Puzzle that refuses dismissal is the most dangerous kind." He stepped forward, glass crunching underfoot, the sound breaking the silence like breath after drowning. I followed, though every instinct warned against re-entering that violated place. The nave lay in devastation. Benches toppled, the altar cracked down its center. The bell, its rim split clean through, rested in fragments beneath the tower arch. Holmes crouched beside one of the larger pieces and tapped it gently with his knuckle. The sound was dull, unmusical. Yet even as he withdrew his hand, a faint answering tap came from within the broken half, hollow and deliberate. He looked up sharply. "Watson, fetch your revolver." I drew it at once. "You think someone's inside?" "Someone, or something of his design." He struck the fragment again. This time the reply came quicker, almost impatient. Holmes turned the shell of bronze upon its side. A smaller shape rolled free from the interior, a metal cylinder, no longer than my hand, capped at both ends with wax. Holmes took it up, eyes bright. Our final voice. He broke the seal. Inside lay a parchment coil, wound tightly about a sliver of steel wire. The writing, cramped and elegant, bore the same hand as the inscription upon the coffin. Holmes read aloud, "To the finder of silence. If this note is heard, not read, the circle completes. Every sound begets its air. Bury me where no echo falls." Holmes's brow furrowed. Sedgwick's confession and his riddle, the experiment extended even to his own end. I frowned. "You mean he planned for us to find this?" "Planned, perhaps, but not anticipated that reason would strip sentiment of its music." He rose, the cylinder glinting between his fingers. "He has hidden one last device. Note the wire, drawn fine as a violin string. He meant it to resonate with the bell's collapse. The last note, Watson, is literal." We turned as a faint rustle came from the porch. Henry stood there, pale, holding his mother's arm. Both looked as though they had aged years since we left them. "Is it over?" Mrs. Fenton asked. Holmes regarded her gently. Over in sound, perhaps, but not in meaning. The boy's eyes fixed on the cylinder. "What is that?" "A confession, bound to the very tone that condemned you all," Holmes replied. "The Reverend sought absolution through symmetry. Each sin must produce its echo. This was his proof." Henry swallowed. "Then destroy it, please." Holmes's fingers tightened around the device. "And let silence erase understanding." "No, my boy. There is mercy in memory, provided we learn to listen without fear." He placed the cylinder upon the cracked altar, then turned toward me. "Watson, you will recall the principle of sympathetic vibration. If one note can awaken another, so too can the absence of tone still its twin. We shall end this as it began, with a knock." He drew from his pocket the same small bough he had held in Baker Street that morning, its hair faintly singed by firelight. He ran it lightly along the wire. A soft hum rose, wavering in pitch until it met some unseen harmony within the walls. The sound deepened, expanding through the air like a held breath. The cylinder quivered. Then, all at once, the tone inverted, a low sigh escaping as if the building itself exhaled relief. The vibration ceased. Holmes lowered the bow. "There, the echo has met its equal." Mrs. Fenton's shoulders sagged. "You mean it's gone?" He smiled faintly. "Gone where all echoes go, into the heart that hears them." For a moment, none of us spoke. The hush that followed was not emptiness, but peace, rich and complete. Even the broken glass seemed content to lie still. Then, softly, another sound intruded, the scrape of metal on stone. Larch emerged from the vestry shadows, soot-streaked and trembling. "I thought it safe," he muttered. But when the bell split, something fell from above. This. He held out a second cylinder, nearly identical to the first. Holmes took it, his eyes narrowing. Ah, so the sermon had a reprise. He removed the wax seal. Inside, instead of parchment, rested a thin strip of tin engraved with grooves like those of a phonograph record. Watson stared. "A recording?" Holmes nodded grimly. "And now, at last, we may hear the ghost speak with its true voice." He set the tin upon the altar stone and turned the wire of the first cylinder across its ridged surface. As the friction began, a faint vibration stirred, then a whisper emerged, hollow yet unmistakably human. "If sound endures, so too does guilt. Let none say they were not warned." The message ended with a single, distinct tap, the final punctuation of Sedgwick's creed. Holmes exhaled slowly. "There is your encore, Watson. The last illusion unmasked. A recording device. Crude yet prophetic. The Reverend wished to ensure his sermon outlived both body and belief." Mrs. Fenton covered her face. "Can we not destroy it now?" Holmes lifted the strip gently. "Destruction would only grant it drama. Better to bury it among the ordinary, where echoes die of neglect." He handed it to me. "See that it reaches Scotland Yard. Lestrade will find it a curiosity, but no menace." As he turned toward the doorway, the lantern flame flickered once more. The night beyond had begun to pale with the first hint of dawn. The wind moved softly through the cracked panes, carrying with it a sound so faint I could scarcely tell whether it was memory or breeze. A single hollow knock fading into morning light. Holmes paused, hat in hand. "Even now it persists," he said quietly. "But that, Watson, is life. The echo we mistake for ending." We stepped outside together, the dawn mist closing gently behind us. From far within the ruined church came one last answering note, delicate as breath upon glass. Holmes did not turn as the faint note trembled through the air. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his silhouette framed against the pallid light stealing over the graveyard. His voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. "Watson, do you hear how it softens? The echo learns restraint, as if the church itself has grown weary of listening." I nodded, my breath visible in the cool dawn. "You speak of it as though it were alive." He smiled faintly. "In a sense, it is. Guilt animates objects as surely as breath animates man. The difference lies only in the material that vibrates." We began to walk along the narrow path between the headstones. The mist hung low, blurring names into anonymity. Henry followed at a distance, supporting his mother, while Larch trailed behind, uncertain and hollow-eyed. Holmes halted near the boundary wall. "We have spent a night among artifices of repentance," he said. "Now we must decide which of them to leave standing." I glanced back toward the ruin. "Will the structure hold?" "It will hold enough," he replied. "The damage has silenced its voice, but not its meaning. Each fracture is a confession written in stone." The crunch of gravel approached behind us. Lestrade's familiar figure emerged from the gate, overcoat flapping in the thin wind. "Holmes, I might have known you'd be at the center of whatever this unholy business is. The inspector from the parish sent word of an explosion at St. Agnes." "Merely a resonant failure," Holmes said lightly. "A sermon that grew too loud for its own good." Lestrade scowled. "You'll forgive me if I prefer plainer English. Is anyone dead?" "One conscience, perhaps," Holmes answered, "but the bodies remain inconveniently alive." I interceded quickly. "We have a written confession from Reverend Sedgwick, and these devices, recording cylinders, contain evidence of his manipulation." Holmes handed over the wax-sealed tin. "Deliver this to the yard. Handle with care. It holds more noise than sense." Lestrade turned the object over in his hand. "You always did find mischief where no sane man would look. Shall I assume you'll have your usual statement ready by noon?" "I fear so," Holmes replied dryly, "though you may wish to file it under the case of the conscience that would not cease." The inspector muttered something about lunatics and left the way he came. As his footsteps faded, Holmes's gaze drifted back to the church tower, where a single surviving pane caught the light. "Watson," he said, "what do you observe?" "Only the reflection of the rising sun," I said. He shook his head. "Listen, not look." I obeyed, and beneath the morning hush came the faintest susurrus. Wood settling, air shifting, a whisper more felt than heard. "There," Holmes murmured. "The resonance endures. But now it obeys nature, not obsession. The difference between guilt and memory, Watson, is that one punishes, the other teaches." "We," rejoined the Fentons near the gate. Mrs. Fenton, pale but composed, inclined her head. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "you've given us peace where faith failed." Holmes bowed slightly. "Peace, madam, is merely understanding granted a quieter room." The boy stepped forward hesitantly. Will the voices ever come back?" Holmes placed a hand on his shoulder. "Only if you refuse to speak your own truth. Silence unattended becomes echo. But honesty, that is the sound that never returns." A faint tremor passed through the ground then, subtle but distinct. The boy stiffened. "Did you feel that?" Holmes nodded. "The soil resettling. When sound dies, it sinks into the earth that bore it. Nature, my boy, is the greatest archivist of all." We turned toward Baker Street by mid-morning, the road still damp from night rain. Holmes walked in silence for a while, his features thoughtful, almost melancholy. The small brass bow protruded from his pocket like a relic of war. After some minutes, I ventured, "You seemed unusually moved by this case." He gave a soft, humorless chuckle. "When a man builds instruments to contain his own remorse, Watson, I see a reflection not of madness but of method misapplied. How often have I, too, turned reason into a form of penitence?" "You?" I said. "Surely you of all men." He interrupted gently. "I, too, have built chambers of echo. They are lined not with stone, but with deduction. Every case I close repeats within me until the next one drowns it out. That is the cost of listening too keenly." I regarded him with quiet respect. "Then perhaps, Holmes, even you must learn to rest." He smiled without warmth. "Rest is merely a quieter form of curiosity." We walked on, the clop of the handsome horses in the distant street blending with the lingering memory of that hollow motif. Yet something about it had changed. No longer did it seem ominous. It pulsed now like the rhythm of breath, life reclaimed from fear. When we reached our door, Holmes paused before ascending. "Watson," he said suddenly, "fetch the violin." I obeyed, handing it to him wordlessly. He tuned it with unusual care, each string finding its tone with soft precision. Then, drawing the bow once across the G string, he produced a low, resonant hum that filled the sitting room with calm. "There," he said quietly. "The same note that haunted St. Agnes, but gentler. The same frequency, transformed by intent. Do you understand, Watson?" "I think so," I said. "You have turned the echo into harmony." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. The principle holds true for every human fault. Guilt is but emotion, vibrating without control. Reason can tune it." He let the note fade, replaced by the soft tick of the mantel clock. Outside, the street stirred with morning bustle. Vendors calling, hooves striking stone. Yet within our small room, all felt balanced, as if London itself had joined in that fragile silence. Holmes set down the violin and looked toward the window. "There are cases, my dear Watson," he said slowly, "that end not with the capture of a criminal, but with the quieting of an echo. This was one." Then, faintly, whether from the street below or some trick of resonance, I heard it once more. 3 soft knocks and 2 in reply, perfectly timed, as if London itself remembered the rhythm. Holmes's gaze flicked toward me, a spark of wry amusement in his eyes. "Ah," he murmured, "our audience applauds." Holmes remained standing by the window, the faint glimmer of amusement still hovering in his eyes as the echo of those phantom knocks faded into the hum of the street. Then his expression altered. "Curious," he murmured. "The rhythm persists precisely even in the open air, 3 and 2, as measured as ever." I listened again, but all I could hear was the muffled commotion of Baker Street below. Carriage wheels, boot steps, and the cry of a newspaper boy. "Surely, Holmes," I said, "it is only coincidence. The mind, once attuned to a sound, invents its recurrence." He shook his head slightly. "Coincidence is a harmony too easily credited to chance. You forget that echoes do not belong to buildings but to minds. The reverberation has simply changed its instrument." He turned away from the window and crossed to his desk, where the brass cylinder from St. Agnes still lay beside a scatter of papers. "Observe," he continued, "its wax seal remains intact, yet the air around it hums faintly." I bent nearer, and indeed, when I held my breath, there came a soft vibration, like the whisper of a tuning fork long after it has been struck. Holmes tapped it gently with a pencil. "There. The sound has not ceased. It merely seeks new mediums. It is an echo that refuses extinction." I could not repress a shiver. "Then what are we to do with it?" He smiled faintly. "Listen." He opened the small lid of his tobacco jar and placed the cylinder inside, closing it with deliberate care. "Containment through dull matter," he said. "Sand, wood, or in this case, shag tobacco. All excellent dampeners of conscience." I laughed despite myself. A fitting burial for our phantom sermon. Holmes's gaze softened. "Perhaps, but recall, Watson, Sedgwick's phrase, 'Bury me where no echo falls.'" The man's brilliance lay not in his theology, but in his precision. He predicted that every attempt to silence would itself create resonance. Even now we speak of him in that speech he endures. I considered this quietly. "Then the true experiment was not architectural at all," I said, "but psychological." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Just so. He designed a contagion of conscience. The material devices, coffins, bells, tubes, were but scaffolds. The true structure was human guilt, which amplifies itself more perfectly than any organ pipe." He took up his violin again, plucking one string idly. "What remains to us, Watson, is to decide whether reason can master such music or merely accompany it. I studied him as he spoke. The lean profile illuminated by morning light, the fine tremor of his hand as it rested on the bow. "Holmes," I said softly, "you speak as though you envied the Reverend's madness." His lips curved slightly. "Not envy, my dear fellow. Understanding. We are all echo makers in our way. Each case I resolve leaves behind its small vibration. Tonight, for instance, a man sought forgiveness through sound. I merely translated it back into silence. That is not triumph, Watson. It is transcription." There was a melancholy in his tone that silenced me. Outside, a hansom clattered by. Its wheels struck a loose cobblestone with a hollow report, the familiar motif reborn. Holmes smiled at the sound, eyes half closed. "London itself joins the refrain," he said. "A city built upon echoes. Every footstep an argument, every bell a confession." "Then what lesson do you draw from it?" I asked. He set the violin aside. "That nothing dies which has found its frequency. People mistake immortality for divine favor, but it is merely perfect resonance. The Reverend discovered it by accident, as have we, time and again." I moved to the hearth, stirred the embers. "Then his punishment is the same as yours, Holmes, to hear forever." He looked at me with that brief flash of warmth so rare in him. "Ah, but you, Watson, are my silence. You absorb the excess and turn it into story. Without your pen, I should deafen myself with thought." I could not answer at once. The compliment, if such it was, struck deeper than his usual banter. "Then perhaps we are both instruments," I said at last. "Indeed, two strings upon the same bow." He turned then, glancing once more toward the tobacco jar. A soft thud interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson knocking before entering with the Morning Post. "Just there, Watson," Holmes said with a smile. "The world never fails to provide its percussion." She laid 2 envelopes upon the table and departed. Holmes examined them, slit one open, and gave a short exclamation. "Ah, most instructive. What is it?" "A note from Lestrade. The contents of Sedgwick's second cylinder have been examined by the yard's instrument maker. It contained a continuous loop of wire which, when exposed to vibration, reproduces a single phrase. It never ends." I stared. "You mean it speaks even without mechanism?" "Precisely. A mechanical echo, perpetual as guilt itself." He placed the letter aside. How fitting that the man who sought eternal confession should achieve it through technology rather than theology. He crossed to the window again, gazing out toward the grey sprawl of London. "Do you see, Watson? The age turns upon invention. Soon every man will record his own conscience and call it progress." There was bitterness in his voice now, a weariness that no deduction could dispel. "You fear the future," I said quietly. "I fear only perfection," he replied. "An echo so flawless it no longer requires its source." He closed the blinds with a decisive snap. "Come, Watson, let us have breakfast before the next sound arrives. I have no appetite for ghosts before coffee." But even as he spoke, from somewhere within the walls there came a single, muted knock. Not from the street, nor from the door, but deep inside the room, as if the building itself had remembered. Holmes looked up, eyes gleaming with that familiar spark between reason and wonder. "Ah," he said softly, "there's the refrain again." For several seconds neither of us moved. That single, muffled knock hung in the air between us, neither invitation nor threat, merely the quiet persistence of something unfinished. Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the wainscoting as if he could see through it, tracing the vibration's path through plaster, timber, and brick until it reached some inaudible conclusion within himself. He spoke at last, very softly. "There, Watson, the city gives us its verdict." I held my breath. "On what, Holmes?" "On the futility of silence," he replied. "We chase it, thinking to end the noise of the world, yet each solution, each coffin, each case, merely rearranges the air. He stepped closer to the wall and laid his fingers against it. The knock had ceased, but the faint tremor remained. Do you feel that, my dear fellow? A pulse, the same frequency as before, only subdued, humanized. London breathes through its walls. I could not help smiling. You make poetry of masonry. He turned, his expression grave but not unkind. Perhaps. But tell me, what are we, if not walls filled with echoes of our own making? The morning light crept along the carpet, striking the legs of his chair. Holmes walked to it and sat, the tension leaving him at last. For once, his hands lay idle upon the armrests. The case, though it masqueraded as crime, was always confession, he said. The reverend, the coffin maker, the boy, they only struck chords we were meant to hear. The rest was physics and folly. I seated myself opposite, notebook closed upon my knee. And what of you, Holmes? Do you consider yourself absolved? He smiled faintly. From what? From hearing too much. He regarded me with that sharp, reflective amusement that always accompanied the end of a difficult inquiry. My dear Watson, I rely upon you for precisely that service. You convert my noise into narrative. In your pages, guilt becomes order, confusion becomes music. Without your pen, I should be an unresolved chord. His words, though lightly spoken, moved me more than he could have guessed. Then perhaps, I said, the true echo lies not in the world, but in friendship. He looked down, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. A dangerous sentiment, yet not entirely untrue. Outside, the hum of traffic was beginning to rise. The city awakened reluctantly, as though mindful of the night's intrusion. From far down Baker Street came the rhythmic strike of a smith's hammer. 3 beats, a pause, then 2. The pattern was so precise that I caught Holmes's eye, and we both laughed quietly, the sound carrying a strange tenderness. Even the blacksmith joins the chorus, he said. London has a sense of humor, if nothing else. I leaned back, studying him as he poured the last of the coffee. Will you rest now? He raised an eyebrow. Rest? When the universe insists on tuning itself by increments of irony? Hardly. But I shall... Listen. He drew the violin once more from its case and touched bow to string. A low note filled the room, pure and steady, a perfect fifth above the hum we had heard. For a moment it seemed as though the walls themselves breathed in sympathy. He closed his eyes, and the melody rose, simple, searching, then resolving in a cadence so gentle it scarcely existed at all. There, he murmured. That is the antidote to guilt, Watson. Transformation. To music? To comprehension, he said. Every mystery, when understood, becomes harmony. The note faded. Only the mantel clock spoke now, marking the seconds with soft authority. Holmes set the violin aside and reached for his pipe. The smell of tobacco mingled with the thin, bright sunlight that now washed the shelves of chemical glassware and books. He spoke again without looking at me. You will write this one, I suppose, if you permit it. He smiled. Permit? My dear fellow, you are the echo. The story belongs to you long before it reaches the page. I opened the window then, and a current of air stirred the curtain. From the street below came the everyday music of London, vendors calling, wheels clattering, voices overlapping in 1,000 forgotten keys. The ordinary had returned, and with it, peace. Holmes rose and joined me. Together we looked out upon the city, its roofs glimmering in the thin gold of morning. You see, Watson, he said, the world has already forgotten the Reverend's experiment. Yet somewhere, perhaps in a beam of that church or in the timbers of a passing cart, the sound lingers still. It will fade, but not vanish. Neither do we. He turned away, reaching for his hat. Shall we take a walk? The air has the freshness of something forgiven. As you wish, I said. But Holmes, one last question. Do you think the echo ever truly ends?" He paused at the threshold, the faintest smile at his lips. "It need not. So long as there is conscience, there is resonance. So long as there is friendship, there is reply." He opened the door, and the soft creak of the hinge gave its own quiet punctuation. I followed him into the hall, the day bright before us. As we stepped into the street, a distant church bell began its morning toll, clear, even, unhurried. And in that measured rhythm, 3 notes and 2, I heard not dread but affirmation, the heartbeat of the living city, answering itself forever.